Welcome to episode 26 of Call to the Bar, International Law Over Drinks, our year in review episode and the final episode of season 1. And I'm pretty impressed we've made it this far myself. I also note that we're recording on 26 November 2024. So happy 40th anniversary of military and paramilitary activities in and against Nicaragua, brackets Nicaragua and the United States of America, questions of jurisdiction and or admissibility to everyone who celebrates. Today's conversation will feature the whole team bar one. Me, Douglas Guilfoyle, Professor of International Law and Security at UNSW Canberra, as well as Dr. Juliette McIntyre, now or soon to be a senior lecturer at the University of South Australia and also everyone's favourite procedure goblin, Dr. soon to be Associate Professor Tamsin Phillipa Paige of Deakin University, and Associate Professor Imogen Saunders, Director of the Australian National University Centre for International and Public Law. Dina Suvala sadly cannot join us today. She was last seen under a pile of marking before fleeing on annual leave. But I think we can all reveal now that Dina will be joining UNSW Sydney, the mothership to my own satellite campus, in 2025. But before we begin, I remind everyone that in these informal conversations, we are, as always, speaking off the cuff and without benefit of footnotes, and nothing we say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer-reviewed. Now, while Australian end-of-year or pre-Christmas work parties can be robust affairs, given that we're all at our desks at 2:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, our end-of-year drinks are likely to be a little tamer, although not necessarily in the legal analysis. So, what's everyone drinking?
Okay, well, I'll start. I have 2 drinks because it is hot as fuck in Canberra. And so I have as I mentioned on Blue Sky, I have hit peak wanker coffee season where I brew my own cold brew from patio coffee beans. So I've got a glass on ice of cold brew that Douglas was warned about in terms of caffeine content. And I have a San Pellegrino orange and pomegranate as well, also with a metric fuck ton of ice.
Excellent. And we need to get those swears in early for the Christmas party. And I left my San Pellegrino behind, but am in fact drinking some of Tamsin's cold brew, which has a truly frightening quantity of caffeine in it, even for me, whose morning coffee used to be described by a good friend as the world's only quintuple espresso. Juliette.
I'm also having wanky coffee. I'm a big cold brew person, so I did think about getting out the champagne, even though it's the afternoon, given it's Christmas. But no, I need to be somewhat sensible.
And I'm also having coffee, though not cold brew. I'm having hot coffee. But the exciting thing about my coffee, and I'll hold it up for you guys, is the cup I'm drinking out of. And this is now showing off my geeky cred, because this is a replica of the coffee cup that Captain Catherine Janeway drinks out of on the USS Voyager.
Sweet.
Outstanding.
I fucking love that. I want one.
I'm having my captain's coffee.
Oh, how many replicator rations did that cost you?
Well, yes, I use fresh beans. But as a piece of trivia, I have actually been to the future birthplace of Captain Catherine Janeway in Bloomington, Indiana. Not on purpose. I mean, I went on purpose to Bloomington. I went for a conference, but I only discovered it was her birthplace when I was there and was walking around the town and saw a statue of the future captain-to-be, which I found very exciting.
Well, we're well into both coffee wankery and sci-fi references, and we're only about 3 minutes into the episode. Things can only possibly improve, which would be a good thing given the state of international law this year. So I'm glad we're all starting with some optimism before we spend the rest of the episode bringing ourselves down. All right. I mean, it's been a year when international law scarcely seems to have been out of the news at all at any point. Conflicts in Ukraine, Gaza, and Lebanon have dominated headlines in the West, unfortunately overshadowing conflict elsewhere, especially in Sudan. Obviously, we here at Call to the Bar have spent a lot of time on issues related to the conflicts in Gaza and Lebanon this year, and we'll probably come back to the question of the International Criminal Court arrest warrants announced last week. But what other international law stories or developments have stuck with each of you this year? Are they stories from the headlines or topics that have perhaps flown under the radar? Who'd like to start?
I'm happy to, though hopefully I'm not stealing Juliette or Tamsin's one. But the one I wanted to talk about was Australia's announcement that they are going to take Afghanistan to the International Court of Justice.
I have comments on that too, so I'll
Awesome.
follow up from you.
For violations of the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. A couple of things I find really interesting about that, and I'm sure Tamsin and Juliette do too, but the one I wanted to bring up is just the procedural point of the existence of a dispute, because, you know, for those who aren't so obsessed with the International Court of Justice, as perhaps some of us are, one of the requirements for a case before the ICJ is that there is a dispute between the two parties. And I mean, you might think, well, it's sort of obvious if you're taking another country to court that there's a dispute between you. And often, you know, historically, the existence of a dispute was never really a big point until the Marshall Islands tried to take various countries, including the UK, to the ICJ for non-adherence to nuclear non-proliferation. And at that point, the ICJ actually dismissed the case, saying that the Marshall Islands hadn't raised their dispute specifically with the UK, even though they had sort of aired more general claims in various international fora. Now, there was a lot of sort of controversy about that at the time, that it was such a technical point for it to turn on to have the whole case dismissed. But what you've seen since then is that when countries want to go to the ICJ, they follow almost a formula of how they basically create this dispute. So they'll announce that they're going to do it. They'll specifically name the country that they're going to bring. They'll do so publicly. They'll do so in international forums. And then they'll wait a period, usually of about 6 months, before they actually file the claim. And all of that is so that when it comes to the court, there can be no argument that the other country wasn't aware that the country bringing the claim had this issue with them. And so that's exactly what Australia's done. By announcing it, by giving the press release, by saying we're going to take Afghanistan, not actually filing the claim yet, essentially we're just setting up the ground so that when and if it does come to court, that's not a ground that Afghanistan could argue against us with.
There's also a technical thing there too, though, isn't there? Because in the CEDAW, there's a requirement. Now, this is very much off the top of my head, and I'm going to get the details wrong, but isn't there like a requirement that you have to go to negotiation or arbitration or something first? Like there's this weird sort of period, and then if that doesn't work for like 6 months, then you go to the court. I'm pretty sure there's like this kind of clause up in there as well. So they might be setting that up.
Trying to find the dispute settlement clause.
But it was while you're doing that, I was just going to say it was on my list too, because it's such a fascinating idea. And a lot of people are concerned with it because there's two things that have been, I think, in my mind with this litigation. One is a lot of people going, oh, well, does this mean that you somehow recognize the Taliban as the valid government of Afghanistan? And so there's this really kind of weird, I guess, slightly artificial division between, you know, the government and the state of Afghanistan. But then that leads to a whole bunch of questions about how do you serve the papers, for example? Who are you serving them on? Which diplomat is going to be the, you know, representative in the court, and all these kinds of things as well, which has been really fascinating. The other thing that's interesting about this litigation is what's the point of it, right? Because we can all recognize the horrors of life as a woman or as a female presenting person in Afghanistan, right? There's no question that they are absolutely oppressed, and that this is almost certainly a breach of their human rights in multiple factors, not just under the Convention for the elimination of discrimination against women, blah, blah, blah. But what's going to happen? Is the Taliban going to actually do anything here? No, they're not. They're not going to. They might not even show up. They're not necessarily going to, you know, obey anything that the International Court of Justice has to say. And I know I'm rambling, but we're starting to see often now, I think, the court getting used for this symbolic sort of, action, saying we declare that this is very wrong and everyone's very upset with you. But then there's not necessarily an expectation of compliance from the respondent state. So that is interesting about it as well, I think.
Yeah. So I'll just jump in again, and then I think Tamsin has stuff to say. But the first is, I mean, you're dead right, Juliette. So it's Article 29, that's negotiation, then arbitration, and then International Court of Justice if that fails. And the arbitration one, you don't have to go to arbitration if you can't agree on the organisation of the arbitration. So I'm sure that's what will probably happen. But I guess the other two things I wanted to say was, the other interesting thing, I think, is that, of course, it wasn't the Taliban who ratified the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Afghanistan joined the convention when it was still under administration, I believe. And so it was a different government. Now, of course, in international law, you know, governments don't matter. But because that's one of the things my students ask me is why on earth is Afghanistan joined this treaty? Why would the Taliban join this treaty? Well, the Taliban weren't in power when they did. But the other thing about, being used as symbolic, I guess it goes back to our earlier episode and Doug's project. I'm just thinking of the Chagos Islands here, is maybe sometimes it is just about getting weight up and an ICJ judgment won't be complied with, but it's just another brick in a wall that's very slowly being built. And down the track, maybe it will have some effect. That's my hopeful take, at least.
Tamsin?
Okay, so I have many thoughts on this judgment, or on this set of things. It was on my list as the thing to discuss, but first I would like to raise two minor points that I think are worth discussing that international law should be looking into. And first of all, there clearly should be a business and human rights law case to bring against Lime Crime for ceasing to make their makeup line. I'm very upset about that. And someone needs to have a talk with my dog about her persistent violations of the Chemical Weapons Convention. But now that we've got those two very personal issues of international law out of the way, CEDAW case. So, first few points kind of going in on responding to what's been said there. I want to make the point that I kind of made back when we were talking about the Houthi and Yemen, of international law is agnostic about form of government. And whether or not you want to recognize the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan, de facto they are, and at some point facts matter. And yes, they weren't in power when the ratification of CEDAW happened, but they inherited it as the new government of the same state. It's not even a successor state, it's the same state. And they haven't withdrawn. So yeah, they're bound. It's like, suck it up. On the point of this whole thing, and this goes to the symbolic, what's the point? This is a very, very good and important case being brought by bad people for bad reasons. And by bad people, yes, I do say the governments of Australia, Canada, and Germany. And for bad reasons, they are needing a win here with domestic constituents who are pissed at them for doing nothing about genocides and doing fuck all about their domestic issues on women's rights. So they're trying to get runs on the board as they're coming into re-election in their domestic constituencies to not get voted out. So yes, it's a good case. It's very important. It's very good that it's being brought. I'm not convinced that if we get a change of governments in the states that are bringing it, that it will continue. But it's being brought for domestic constituency reasons to try and win back voters who are pissed at them and who don't want to vote for these centre-right parties that think they're the centre-left and then get angry when they lose votes to the parties on the left because they're enacting centre-right neoliberal policies and trying to say that there are good people on all sides. It's a bad people bringing a good case for bad reasons. And while it's about women's issues, and I have no issue there, I would very much hesitate for all the people saying that this is a wonderful feminist win to temper that, because there's nothing I have seen in any of the case coverage that suggests that it's being brought on feminist grounds. It's being brought on treaty grounds and women's rights, but there's nothing I would say that aligns with feminist ethos and theory and methodologies within the case either. So yes, I think this is a big thing, and I know that we're going to have a whole episode on it next season when we have more information, but I don't think there's been enough coverage, and I don't think there's been enough coverage about the why, and about why the people bringing this case are terrible people who created the conditions for the Taliban to come into power anyway. Regardless of how far back you want to go in history, whether you want to look at the US invasion and just there forward, or whether you want to go back to the Russian invasion in the 80s, where the CIA established the Taliban to give them by giving them weapons to fight against the Russians. These people created the Taliban, and now they're upset that the people that they created, that they put into power, are doing bad things. This is just all kinds of bad people doing good things for bad reasons.
If I can jump in, I mean, speaking of bad people, Doug, you foreshadowed that we're going to talk about the arrest warrants issued by the ICC last week, notably for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant. Now, look, you're our resident international criminal law expert and longtime ICC skeptic. I want to turn the conversation to this issue and ask what your reactions to this rather significant piece of news are.
Right. Well, in terms of just a few quick key points, I mean, the first thing is, this is long overdue, right? Tamsin and I were doing the maths before we went on air about how long it's taken for these arrest warrants to be issued. It's been 186 days since the prosecutor's initial request, during which time the bench, the pre-trial chambers, had to be reconstituted because the presiding judge has taken leave for health reasons. But on top of that, they allowed a situation that Sergei Vasiliev described, I believe, as a clown show or a circus, where it was open slather for amicus curiae briefs, whether they were relevant to the questions of jurisdiction or not, some of which chose to attempt to relitigate the prosecutor's choice of charges. So that was 60 submissions, many of which were of dubious relevance. And while amici submissions have been allowed before the court before, it has never been on such a kind of completely open basis with no gatekeeping either as to the issues raised or the kinds of bodies that could, or persons who could put in submissions. So the court has not started by covering itself in glory. Okay, so we have 3 arrest warrants confirmed, and I'll remind listeners that the standard for an arrest warrant being issued by the International Criminal Court is not beyond reasonable doubt. It is that there are reasonable grounds to suspect these people have committed the crimes. And they've been confirmed against, as you say, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, both of Israel, and the Hamas leader Daif, presuming that he is still alive. Now, I'll link to the show notes because an excellent nuts and bolts explainer has been written by Tom Dannenbaum on Just Security, covering the detail. But just at sort of a high level, Daif's been confirmed with a range of charges, including crimes against humanity and war crimes involving hostage taking, extermination, acts of mass killing, and sexual offences against hostages. Gallant and Netanyahu have had charges confirmed against them in terms of both war crimes and crimes against humanity, notably, most notably, starvation as a war crime. And press releases goes into some detail, extent to which one can infer from acts of policy around the admission of aid into Gaza that there has been a deliberate policy of depriving the population of Gaza of necessities for their survival. Interestingly, though, extermination was not confirmed as a war crime against Gallant and Netanyahu. Most interestingly, though, I think, in terms of potential interaction with ongoing cases at the ICJ, the crime against humanity of extermination through conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of part of the population in Gaza was confirmed. Now, that same act can form the underlying basis of a charge of genocide if it is also coupled with the intent to destroy a group in whole or in part as such. So that same underlying offence can be charged as a crime against humanity if it involves a widespread and systematic attack against a civilian population, or if you can prove the additional higher intent requirement as genocide. So there's an interesting issue there in that at this stage, an international tribunal has adjudicated there are reasonable grounds to conclude those underlying acts are occurring. Finally, in terms of how this falls out, there'll be an issue of where these suspects can travel. Certainly for Netanyahu and Gallant, in theory, any state of the 124 members of the International Criminal Court should arrest them on arrival on their territory. There's already been signals from some states that have already defied ICC arrest warrants, say in the case of Vladimir Putin, that Prime Minister Netanyahu remains welcome in their territory. So that's going to be an ongoing test for the court. There's also going to be the question of whether this will invoke either at the national or the international level the relitigation of the question of head of government immunity from criminal process in another country. Without bogging us down into something we might go into in more detail next year, the International Criminal Court statute on its face acknowledges that while there is no immunity once you're before the court, you cannot be, in principle, surrendered to the court in violation of obligations owed to a non-state party in terms of, say, status of forces agreements or potentially things like head of government or other status immunities. Now, the appeals chamber of the ICC has already held that, don't worry, customary international law has done away with those immunities. We don't have to respect them. So that decision is kind of binding in the internal law of the ICC and should, one would think, be binding on all state parties to the ICC, but a number of states basically think that decision is wrong in law, whether they say it out loud or not, which makes statements by some states that they will comply with their international law obligations should Netanyahu enter their territory a bit of a placeholder. Let's see what that actually means in practice. Does that mean executing the warrants according to ICC, as it were, internal law? Or does that mean some states may be sitting on a Foreign Office legal memorandum saying, actually, we think this guy still has immunity rationale personae? All right. Also, Israel has made a lot of arguments in the past based on jurisdiction and admissibility. Those were all thrown out at this stage because you get to make jurisdiction and admissibility arguments once there is a case. And there's only a case once you have arrest warrants issued against individuals. Up to that point in the ICC sequence of events, all you've got is a situation. So in a sense, we can expect Israel to relitigate for the second or third time, depending on how you want to count this, the question of jurisdiction in respect of Israeli nationals. So that's not going anywhere. And eventually, should anyone come before the court, we'll move to confirmation of charges proceedings, where again, the evidentiary threshold will be different, and it will be that there are substantial grounds to believe that the person has been implicated in the crimes. Here endeth my steam train summary.
Doug, can I just jump in there? Just your point about countries using very careful language, I think is so interesting, because while you were talking, I just pulled up a Guardian article, and the headline of the Guardian article says the UK would comply with Netanyahu arrest warrant. But when you actually look at what was said, the official spokesperson says the UK will always comply with its legal obligations as set out by domestic law and indeed international law. So, it's quite a different position that way. And I wonder...
Or potentially it's a different position. Yeah.
Yeah.
But don't they have the Pinochet cases that would say that war crimes are never done in an official capacity and therefore...
That is not, in my view, what the Pinochet case actually stands for.
I can't remember, so I'm asking.
No. So the Pinochet case, I think, is potentially helpful in a limited way here. And okay, someone can metaphorically just kind of, slap me around the head when I say too much or go too long. But in my view, the mainspring of the Pinochet decision were the terms of the Convention Against Torture. Mm. And the House of Lords in that case found that head of state or head of government immunity has to be waived by the state that has the claim of immunity. And while such a waiver must normally be expressed, it can be inferred by necessary implication from the terms of the treaty. That's what I would say is the narrow majority decision. Some took a more broad, some members of the House of Lords took a more broad brush customary international law based reading, and that's often the version of the Pinochet case we tell ourselves in textbooks. But on my view, it only turns on the terms of the treaty. Now, again, I would say that works for ICC state parties, because you can say, well, the function of Article 27, even though it only talks about the inability to plead immunity once you're before the court, must also bind member states to have effectively already waived immunity so that they would surrender their own officials to the court. But that does not deal with the situation of states which are not party to the treaty, who on a plain reading of the treaty text are still covered by Article 98, which preserves their claims to immunity, unless, looping back, you believe the ICC appeals chamber that customary international law has evolved to a point where you may not make any claim of immunity before an international tribunal, whatever that means, and that holding extends to arrest and surrender proceedings.
Can I just ask a really, really dumb question? Because somebody asked me this on Twitter, is Netanyahu actually the head of state? Do the rules apply to him? Because isn't he prime minister and not president?
Right. So as I recall, someone else can come in over me on this. The general inference taken from the ICJ arrest warrants proceeding is that you have presumptive immunity from the criminal jurisdiction of a foreign state if you're one of the big three: head of state, head of government, or foreign minister. And some would say that senior positions like Minister for Defence are also in there. Otherwise, normally you would get, I believe, foreign relations law and diplomatic practice law not being my strongest suit. There would normally be, say, if you're visiting the UK, a statutory framework that regulated the immunities of non-diplomats, but who were there as part of a special mission.
And my lack of understanding about the Pinochet case shows that most of my work does not deal with what courts do, and that's not where my interest lies.
Yep. No, perfectly legit. Okay, so let's press on, because now, much as I do not want to, at the end of this year in particular, we have to address the 110 kilogram orange in the room, the recrudescence of Donald Trump as US president. So in as little time as we physically and possibly can, what impact do we each think Trump's second term is likely to have on international law, if any? Imogen, you're working on a major project on international law in the age of populism, discussed in episode 17. Would you like to begin? Well, you might not like to, but I'm going to request that you do.
Of course. Yeah, so as you said, on this project with a couple of great colleagues here at the ANU, Jeremy Farrell, Joe Ford, and Nina Araneta Alana, as well as two US-based colleagues, Peter Danchin at Maryland and Shruti Rana at Missouri universities. And this is a project that we've sort of been doing since 2019. It started off in a small form, and now we've got funding to go through to 2027. And so the ongoing joke with the project team is the worse things happen in the world, the better it is for our project. And so every time a new populist leader gets elected, we go, well, there's some more material. Every time, a country purports to ignore an international treaty or whatever, I go, okay, great.
Gotta farm that data.
Exactly.
I mean, I can, on the note of data, very quickly, I can say that ethics committees do not like it when you tell them that getting kidnapped by pirates will render some great observation and interview data. They really don't like that.
I'm more interested in hearing the extent to which Imogen herself has, as field research, engaged in extensive disinformation campaigns to swing elections. But
I am a Russian bot. So when we, the idea that we're now talking about Trump 2.0 is a bit astonishing, I think. But I think the thing about it's a couple of things to say. I think the first thing to say about populism is once it gets into the political bloodstream of a country, it's very difficult to get it out. And so even though Trump lost to Biden and you had those 4 years, populism didn't go away in the US. It was still there. It just wasn't being expressed necessarily through the president at the time. Then the second thing to say is, well, what does this mean for the US, for international law more generally? One of the things about, what Trump did the first time round, because I think that's a pretty good predictor of what he's going to do the second time round. So one of the things he did the first time round that I'm not actually worried about for international law itself is he tried to withdraw from treaties. He put the mechanisms in place to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. He talked about withdrawing from other agreements. And as I said, I'm not really worried about that for international law itself. I mean, it's not good for the goal that the treaty is trying to achieve. It's not good for curbing climate change emissions if the US isn't on board with doing so. But, international law is inherently consent-based. Treaties with withdrawal mechanisms are designed so that states can withdraw their consent. And in terms of the actual, fundamental sort of processes of international law, having a state leave a treaty through the way that the treaty itself sets up isn't a problem. It's just part of international law more generally. Where I think Trump might be much more damaging for international law and institutions is where he bypasses international law entirely and just ignores it. And you see a lot of that in the trade space. having crippled the appellate body. In 2020, Trump put in the tariffs on steel and aluminium from China and the EU and other countries. Prima facie, completely a breach of the rules of the GATT. And although, in the press, Trump called them security tariffs and would probably try and argue the national security exception, I don't see how the law would support that argument. But the point was, with the crippled dispute settlement system, there was really no one who could stop the US, and the US could just use its power and its trade power to impose these tariffs, and that's, I think, exactly what's going to happen again. And the other thing that I think is actually really dangerous is funding. If the US continues to underfund and strip out further funding from international institutions, then the capacity of those institutions to do their work, I think, could be really significantly curtailed. And you're seeing that already. There is a funding crisis already in the UN, and if it gets worse, then I think that could have a big impact.
Yeah, those are really logical and practical points, because a lot of people seem to think that this means the start of some kind of major hot war between the US and China. And I don't think that's really what we're looking at all. I mean, if anything, as you say, the US is going to become more isolationist. I mean, the scary thing for me about Trump is that he's a completely loose cannon. And this time around, there are no safeguards domestically on his policies. And he's stacked his cabinet with reality television stars. Yeah. So I think the odds of extremely unpredictable things happening is vastly increased from the last time we saw him. But yeah, I think it's these things like funding, as you say, which are going to have a really detrimental impact, but are not going to make headline news that those are going to be concerning, and the long-term effect of that, especially as we are trying to, for example, deal with climate change. That's, those are significant concerns.
And can I just say on the China point, and look, you're absolutely right. This is a point of logic, so God knows if it's going to be followed or not. But one thing that happened the last time the US withdrew from, say, the Human Rights Council and from other spaces is that other countries, and China in particular, stepped in to take their place and to start having more influence. And, one of the things that we did some field work in Geneva earlier this year, and one of the things we heard a lot from diplomats is that actually caused quite a bit of concern in the US diplomatic corps, that by withdrawing, they'd basically given space for China and its allies to take some room that it didn't have previously. So I think there's definitely going to be pressure from the diplomats, at least, not to withdraw the same way. But whether that actually has any influence on what Trump does is entirely another question.
Yeah, so on the kind of the WTO appellate body and those sorts of things, I agree with what you're saying on all of those things, but I'd like to point out that Biden could have undone that. They could have reinstituted all of those things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I'd also like to point out that in most political circles, the Democrats would still be a right-wing party. They're neoliberal, girl boss, fat stacks capitalism would not fly as even a centrist party in Australia, let alone elsewhere in the world. So looking at the kind of the two sides of the coin as one being, significantly better, I think is a mistake. And we've seen decades of US exceptionalism to international law, mostly through military adventurism and empire building by proxy. And so from my point of view, this is kind of business as usual, just with less kind words and attempting to justify stuff as legal. The biggest concern is that, Americans are going to have their government do to them what American governments have been doing to people all over the world for decades. And so I actually think that this is very bad for the US and kind of benign for the international legal circles. Apart from Juliette's comment about it, US becomes a bit less predictable.
Or sorry, Doug. Yep, okay, I'm just jumping in over Doug's very politely raised hand. I think the other thing, though, that might be bad for the rest of the world is not things happening at the international level so much, but things happening, and particularly human rights issues happening in the US, that then gets transnationally spread. And so you see both a sort of emboldening of Trumpian style politics. And I think we're seeing that in Australia. Peter Dutton seems to be really trying to get that going here. But also with reproductive rights, we know that anti-abortion movements are borrowing from US-based ones. And there's this spread of things as we have, sexuality, gender, all those human rights become remarkably targeted in the US. I think the worry is it will spread.
I mean, I agree, because we've also seen that with Turf Island and Brexit, and that same level of rhetoric and anti-rights for marginalized people, etc. So I agree with you on all of those points. That Tories are going to become more emboldened to mimic Trump.
So I guess I've got two thoughts here. One, I'd mildly disagree with Tamsin's view that it's generally going to be benign for international law if the US withdraws. And I think partly that goes to Imogen's point about who steps in to fill the space. The US may not have been the most consistent or actor, but it has basically propped up the international legal system that those of us living cozy lives in the West have benefited from. Whether that has been a universally fair or good system, separate question. But I do think the international order, at the very least, is going to come under quite a bit of pressure to change substantially. And I have concerns about the actors who will be pushing for that change and their agenda if US leadership retreats. The one thing I would say is a substantive difference between otherwise, as Tamsin rightly points out, more continuity than difference in foreign policy between Democrat and Republican administrations is the Democrats at least believe in allies, and the security architecture of NATO and Southeast Asia is going to look a lot different if everyone, and now I know what Tamsin's going to say. Tamsin's going to say the US has always been an unreliable ally.
I was actually going to say they believe in vassals, not allies.
Well, we can have that discussion another time. But what happens if the US rolls back its security umbrella? My real concern is that South Korea is going to say, well, we've got a nuclear-armed, mad twin brother in our attic, and we no longer have the US helping us man our battlements. We need a nuclear bomb. Japan going, well, if we're going to maintain our own strategic autonomy without a whole lot of US bases on our soil, we need our own nuclear bomb. Iran going, well, if the US moves from aggressive containment to outright aggression, do we need to complete the steps to make a nuclear bomb? And even if you just have like one of those three break out, or really particularly one of South Korea or Japan, the nuclear non-proliferation regime is in real trouble. And I am substantially more concerned about a world with a lot more nuclear powers in it.
And the other thing that I just wanted to make as a very brief point is that withdrawal itself has, well, rather disrespect for institutions has trickle-down effects too. So if you go backwards in time 10 billion years to the Iraq War, the US was definitely breaking the law, but they really attempted to justify it through some kind of lens of legality. They really, put those things in front of the Security Council and did their best. And so even though that was a charade, in a way it was an important charade because they were still paying lip service to the existence of the institution. When you just stop giving the institution any respect whatsoever and completely ignore it, it in my view, it can have this domino effect, or this sort of, it's not even dominoes, it's more like a seepage, under the foundations, right? And it just cracks away at that institution. And then you just don't, if that continues, it will just crumble eventually. And that's one thing I'm concerned about.
Yeah. However, on the note of that Iraq War commentary, when they presented all of that and the entire Security Council said, no, this is just aggression, stop it, they vetoed the resolution. So it was, I don't think that they're actually that holds as they were trying, because the minute it fell over, they ignored everything. So I think that we can even say back then that they just didn't give a fuck.
I don't,
Mm.
oh, sorry, Imogen, go on.
No, you go, Julia. I'll add after you.
Oh, yeah, no, it was just that I guess just a mild disagreement. Like I think there is something in going through those motions, even if at the end of the day they're just going to veto it and do what they want anyway. Like the US has always done what it wants. There's no one's saying they haven't. But I do think that, trying or pretending even to go through those motions, when you don't have to, and
Yeah.
is somehow upholding the regime, and there's
I'll
just,
agree with you on that. Yeah.
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 And I like the idea of seepage, Juliet, but the other way I think of it is it's sort of an attrition that you just have these small acts. And I think you saw it in the UK too, when they had the Internal Markets Act and they say that they're going to have a specific and limited breach of international law.
Mm.
And there wasn't even a justification that, yes, we're obeying international law. It was, no, we accept we're going to breach it, and that's what we're going to do. And then you saw the Rwanda legislation, which directed the court to ignore certain provisions of the Refugee Convention and any adverse findings. So I think I see that as conceptually different to trying to make an argument in international law grounds, losing it and going ahead anyway, on one hand, and on the other hand, basically saying, we're going to ignore international law, we're breaching it, we're saying we are, and we don't care. And it's the second one that I think is worrying.
So 2 points from me, and then I think we're going to need to move on, much as we could go at this all day. I mean, first, I think there's a really interesting discussion we could have in season 2 about how we as non-Americans perceive American engagement with international law. And my pet theory has been for a long time that essentially for Americans, international law is I say this usually as a sort of half joke, but is the administrative law of empire, right? America is an incredibly legalistic society. It was founded by lawyers. The courts are a major part of not just the administrative state, but the political state. And international law is the register in which you have internal conversations about what America can do in foreign policy. So there's that element. And the less traction law has on that, I think, again, in a way, what we're saying is, the unpredictability goes up because there are fewer guardrails and there are fewer internal agreements about the constraints on American power. And I'm saying those constraints on American power exist from an American perspective, right? They are not imposed by international law from the outside. I had a second point, which I've now completely forgotten. So I think we should just press on. Oh no, my second point was on the decline in respect for international law after Iraq 2003. I do think that dealt an enormous blow to what we now call, or the legitimacy of what we now call, in my view, very ill-advisedly, the rules-based international order, which essentially means public international law with American characteristics, right? And honestly, the state of international humanitarian law post-Gaza, I think, may well completely finish it off in terms of any credibility it has with the Global South, the non-aligned movement. So I did say we would bring ourselves down as we went through this discussion. So let's try and
depressing note to end on, Doug.
Well, so let's try and bring the energy up a little
Change topics.
because so yes, Douglas Guilfoyle declared the end of public international law at 2:49 p.m. Australian Eastern Time on the 26th of November 2024. Mark it in your diaries. Anyway, but look, a consistent theme of these episodes has been academic careers in international law. We spent all of last episode planning Juliette's career or disrupting it with too many ideas. We quiz all of our guests on theirs, and we've discussed our own academic origin stories. In addition, our roadshow episodes, for new listeners, that's episodes 9 and 24, feature us interviewing people at all career stages, from PhD students through to full professors, about how they got into international law. So as part of our year in review, what's been a personal career highlight for everyone here from this year? I mean, Juliette and Tamsin, you've got promotion letters in your hands, so that's got to be a good start.
I have a story I want to tell, but I'm worried I'm going to get in trouble. Okay, so a career highlight for me was being invited to a conference at Tohoku University in Sendai in Japan, which was celebrating the 100th birthday of Judge Oda. Many happy returns to the judge. It was a wonderful conference. I have never been treated so well in my life. But the story I wanted to tell from the conference was Tohoku used to be Judge Oda's home institution. And so they have a wonderful array of memorabilia from his time as a judge and as a professor. They have his robes, they have his copies of his pleadings and things that he'd scribbled on when he was a judge, copy of his PhD, a collection of his. He used to collect when you go on fly first class on KLM. They give you apparently a little ceramic Dutch house, and he collected all of them. So all these little quirky stories, but the one that was sort of funniest was that they had his old photo albums, and so these photos are an absolute treasure trove, and I haven't posted any of them on the internet because I'm a little worried it might cross boundaries. But there were famous international lawyers at the beach with no shirt on, kind of thing. Like it was so funny. And the best moment for me was looking at old photos of Judge Oda when he was a young man. And as regular listeners will know, I'm very into K-pop. And Malgosia Fitzmaurice turns to me and she's like, he was very attractive as a young man, wasn't he? And I'm like, yes, he could have been an idol. I never expected in my life to be having a conversation with Malgosia Fitzmaurice about how Judge Oda was hot. But there you go. That was my professional highlight for the year. Oh, please don't cancel me.
Sometimes, it does turn out that our heroes are also hot. So that's going to take some topping. So who am
Oh
I
my gosh.
who am I going to throw to? Imogen, your mic's open.
Okay. I mean, I can't top that one. But I guess my highlight is I've done quite a bit of travel this year, field work for the project. And that's been really great for two reasons. One is I finally went to Geneva. I've been an international lawyer for ages and ages, and I've never actually visited any of the Geneva-based institutions. So seeing them, understanding the spaces, I actually think is really important to understand how the processes work. And that was excellent. And then the other one is I went to the Philippines. And Doug, I know you also traveled to Manila this year, but the international law community in Manila is just so fantastic, so welcoming, so incredible. And I do think, we all know that, as you were saying earlier, Doug, Americans' view of international law is different, and domestic views of international law are a thing. There is no universal international law. Every country's got its own conception of what it is. And
Hashtag Anthea Roberts is international law international.
Yeah, I was about to
Exactly.
put that in the
Exactly.
Zoom chat.
Yeah. And so I do think by traveling to another country, seeing what international law is for them is really fascinating. Seeing what the priorities are, things that you sort of course you understand when you hear them, but you might not have necessarily thought about them. Like, for example, Duterte, in as much as he was railing against international law and the human rights system, never ever railed against the World Health Organization at the same time Trump was. Why not? Because the Philippines needs the World Health Organization. It's a very necessary institution for them. And so it's just a matter of practical consequence. But I did have one memento there. It wasn't nearly as good as photos of topless international lawyers. But it was the Jessup Cup had travelled to the Philippines because the University of Philippines won the Jessup earlier this year. And I was on a team that won the Jessup in 2003. And so this was my first time being reunited with the cup. And so I got a photo of me with my plaque and the cup.
That's so nice.
20 years later, which was great. 21 years later, in fact.
Okay,
Tamsin.
I definitely cannot improve on any of these stories. So, as Douglas has mentioned, I got promoted to associate professor. That was reasonably nice and reasonably fun. Very relieved about that. At the end of the year, I will no longer be the JD director at Deakin, and my goodness, not having to do law school administration for a little while so I can get some fucking research finished will be a delight. And I published 2 books. So about a month ago, I published 2 books with my wonderful, wonderful colleague, friend, and known associate for all of you criminal lawyers out there. Clewin O'Hara, who is currently at La Trobe, but when they return from baby leave, I believe they're joining Melbourne Law School. I also believe that's public now, so I can say that. And they're a delight. And we published two books on queer encounters with international law, which looks entirely at the interactions between the queer community and international legal frameworks, but then also queer engagements with international law, which looks at applying queer theory to topics that aren't obviously queer issues. And so we published those two books, and that was a huge, fantastic moment. But the highlight actually happened about 3 days ago, when I got a text message from a current UN Special Rapporteur asking if I would supervise their second PhD. And you know what? I'm in awe of this colleague and friend and person. And I'm just really honored that they trust me to supervise their PhD in law because they're from an international relations background, so that they can kind of focus on starting to publish and work in legal spaces. And that's a huge honor.
That's wonderful. Well, I guess in terms of my own reflections, it's been another year with future fellowship funding. Please don't stab me, anyone. And notionally, the ability to concentrate purely on research, but of course, university administration always finds you eventually, no matter how well you hide. But very happy to have got a couple of good articles out this year. One, both co-authored with lovely co-authors. One in ICLQ with Joanna Mossop, and one in the American Journal of International Law with Alex Green. That was the feature of one of our episodes on the Australia-Tuvalu Climate Resettlement Treaty. That's all been great, but in some ways, the sort of highlight of the travel year, Imogen, absolutely right. Manila is amazing, and I learned a lot about the South China Sea dispute, something I already thought I knew a lot about by engaging with Philippine scholars who were there on the front line, including someone who could talk about, and Tamsin will love this, like real field research where she went out with the Coast Guard and was like, oh, wow, that's a frigate-sized China Coast Guard white-painted vessel coming straight at us. And then looking around going, yeah, and the guys running this boat seem a bit freaked out. Maybe I should kind of panic a little bit too. But, just that sense of, being a legal researcher.
No, you don't panic. You just value the data.
Yeah. Always love the data. But no, my sort of personal highlight was I got to be the visiting Lieber Institute scholar at West Point this year, which isn't an excuse to spend all year in the United States. It's an excuse to spend 1 week in the United States chairing a workshop. But it's an extraordinary institution. And I don't think you quite understand the full cultural significance to the American kind of leadership class of West Point as kind of a psychic reality until you've seen it. And I also don't think I'd fully appreciated the just scale of the US military until you go and watch like a couple of thousand trainee officers taking lunch in one 20-minute break, filing in and out of a dining room divided into kind of 6 radial arms, each of which looks like King's College Chapel, and then go, wait, this is just one officer training academy in the United States, and all of these people will have people to command. And suddenly the scale of that organization makes a lot more sense to you.
Who needs Social Security when you have a military?
Well, indeed. But also, as being the visiting Lieber scholar, I have been given a cadet's formal parade ground hat, which is being shipped after me, which I get to put on a little plinth in my office.
Can you put a photo of yourself in the hat in the show notes?
I absolutely can link to a photo of me wearing, and they're called a tar bucket because apparently at some point, possibly during the Revolutionary Wars, they didn't have a lot of money for uniforms. So they actually made the glossy parade ground hats literally out of recycled tar buckets. Look, let's crack on. So our next topic is the podcast itself. I've had an astonishing experience producing called to the bar this year, being myself the entirety of the back end team doing the audio editing and such. And I am enormously grateful for the enthusiasm with which the pod has been received. What reflections do we all have on why this has worked, what we've gotten out of it, what we'd like to do more of or less of in the coming year? The floor is open.
Well, I mean, I have a few thoughts. I think why it's worked is one of those things that you can't really, it's not a formula you can follow. I think it worked because Doug, you came up with a group of people who have different strengths and weaknesses. We have, the formalists, the optimists, the critics, the more cynical among us. And I think all of that blends quite nicely. And we all get on, which also, I think helps.
Helpful, definitely helpful.
Indeed. And others might have other ideas on that. But I guess for me, I just want to say what I have gotten out of it, and I'm sure, I think this is true for all of us. We have all received unsolicited, unprompted messages about the podcast from various people, some of whom are extraordinary luminaries of international law, some of whom are early career researchers, some of whom might not be lawyers at all. But I think knowing that people are listening to us is just such a nice thing, because as an academic, you spend such a big time screaming into the void, and you send your articles and books out and you don't know who's going to read them. People don't tend to send fan mail for articles. Occasionally they do, but it's not something. So people might be reading your work and engaging with it and liking it, but you never know. And so I think what has been really lovely is just knowing that actually this is having a bit of impact and people are finding it useful. I get that personally in my teaching. I'm sure we all do from students, but having it on the, on the more research side and a bit wider than just in the classroom has been so lovely.
Yeah, we've obviously sort of accidentally hit upon this formula, which is so brilliant, and we had no expectations. I think that helped too, right? Like everything that we've achieved has been more than we possibly imagined we could achieve, because I don't know about you guys, but I had like nothing. I was expecting this just to be something it was pretty much an excuse for me to chat with my mates, right? That is how I viewed this podcast. But for me, the thing that I have gotten out of it, it's been wonderful to hear that it's had a benefit for others, which is just, it's so humbling, right? Like I really find it incredible that this has been helpful, and I'm so delighted that anything that has come out of our mouths has helped anyone. But doing one of those roadshow episodes for me, when I did the one at Ansell in back in July, that was huge for me, right? Because I am a very shy person. Like I don't do well in large crowds. I don't do well with new people. And having to do the roadshow episode gave me a reason to talk to other humans at this conference. And I met some amazing and really cool people. And we keep in touch. And so it was a wonderful tool, I guess, for me to kind of get over that conference shyness, and actually have a really good time at Ansell. So that was something I personally got out of this.
So, the kind of the highlight of the podcast for me is going to seem a bit odd because it was a really rough episode to record. But that conversation I got to have with Emily Jones about disability discrimination, disability access in academia, and all of that was actually, it was really both cathartic, but also really important because I know that I spend most of my time in academia trying to tread that line between advocating for access and not pissing people off. And to be able to just sit down with someone else who I've helped come to terms with being disabled, about how actually it's really fucking shit, was really cathartic from that perspective. So that was a real highlight of the podcast for me personally, as has been the opportunity to speak with all of the guests whom I've engaged with professionally, and some of them have become friends as well, about the really cool work they're doing. Like, honestly, that's been the thing for me. Like, it's been great getting messages. Apparently, there are some of you listeners out here who like the fact that I am sweary and snarky. That was my mission brief when I was asked to join the pod. And so I'm glad I'm able to fulfill that for y'all. And I'm glad I've got permission from my co-host to do that because that's just me unfiltered. I'm like that moment in Empire Records where Lucas goes, who knows where thoughts come from? They just appear. That's me in academia. So I'm glad I have the opportunity to do that, and that you all seem to appreciate and enjoy that. But yeah, that conversation with Emily was the highlight of the of season 1 for me.
Can I just add to that before I go to our creator? I think one of the things, Tamsin, and that really powerful episode, but I think it's because Doug from the beginning set it up so it's not just us talking dryly about academic international law, it's about us bringing our whole selves to the podcast and, ourselves as people as well as ourselves as international lawyers. And that's why I think, having the career stuff is so great, but also just bringing in, our other interests and our other positions and situations makes it more than just us discussing what the ICJ is doing, because as fun as that is, I think the pod does a bit more than that.
Thank you, everyone. Look, I'd agree with everything everyone said, and I think it's worked because of ultimately that, overused word, authenticity, right? It works because, as Juliette's put it, it's a conversation amongst friends, which was really what we aimed for from the outset, right? If you want, and not to disparage other podcasts that are available in the field of international law and national security, but if you want kind of, the very formal, scripted, tightly put together, very professional podcasts, those options are available. What we wanted from the outset was to give a sense of how people have these conversations at the conference bar. But more than that, a real highlight for me has been, getting to hang out online with my friends and have these conversations, and surprised to find that, many people apparently like to listen to us having them. But also, very often, I found the conversations generative. I come away from making these episodes and I feel smarter, right? I feel not just like I've learned stuff, but I feel like, I've sharpened my mind against really great ideas and conversations. And that's been a huge boost to morale, in that, again, one of the things about sort of being research only for a period is it can be a tiny bit isolating. Like I don't have, the one thing about teaching is it can be exhausting. Students can be demanding. You can be given too much of it. But when you're in front of a class, you have no option but to be in the moment and to engage with people. And I think, the podcast has given me some of that in a period when I've largely been a desk academic. And I actually think it's been a real top up to my kind of enthusiasm for international law and my enthusiasm about my own research as well. All right, look, we're as always, we're running well past an hour, but apparently people will listen to that. So let's keep going. We're a month and a bit out from most Australian universities shutting down for the Christmas break and people heading off on annual leave, unless, of course, you're teaching a summer session. Sorry, Tamsin. But this summer, what books are we all taking to the beach? Or what other pop culture are we hoping to catch up on over the break?
Well, very importantly in my world, Stray Kids is releasing some new music in about 2 weeks, so I will be hyperfixating on that over the Christmas period. But
Yes.
I do want to plug a book, actually, that I just finished. It's called Toward Eternity. It's by Anton Hur. And I not only sobbed my heart out through this book, but it's speculative fiction. It is not something that I would normally read. I like sci-fi, yes, but this speculative semi-reality, what might the world look like in, hundreds of years, thousands of years kind of thing. Not usually the type of book I would read. Absolutely blown away. We'll put it in the show notes. But I have told everyone, I'm grabbing random people on the street and saying, you have to read this book, because as we are having conversations about the use of artificial intelligence in education and more broadly, this tackles some of those ideas head on, and it's looking at what does it really mean to be human in an age of artificial intelligence. Absolutely fascinating. 20 out of 10 book. Couldn't recommend it more highly.
Fantastic. Imogen?
Thank you. So I'm actually cheating a bit. I'm coming here asking for recommendations because I don't know what I'm going to read over the summer, really. It's
Trashy or serious? Because I have many recommendations.
trashy. So Doug has described my taste in summer reading as a souffle of a book. I like them
Okay.
light.
So please go read Gail Carriger's ParasolVerse. It is delightful. She describes her work as the cupcake equivalent of literature.
Ooh,
It is a delightful three separate series with some interfilling novellas that is a long, slow realization of these intergenerational relationships about the evils of empire in a lovely steampunk environment with werewolves and vampires,
okay. Sounds perfect.
while also be getting very unapologetically horny once you get out of the YA category of the chronologically in production second series, but in world order first series, and being super, super queer inclusive. It's delightful. Go read Gail Carriger.
Okay, there we go. So I've got 2 recommendations already, which is awesome. I will say the other book that I have been meaning to read, and I probably will, is The Lincoln Highway by Amor Towles. And for those listeners who haven't come across Amor Towles, he wrote The Gentleman in Moscow, which has now become a short TV series with Ewan McGregor starring on it. And then he wrote another book first called Rules of Eternity. I'm pretty sure. Rules of Civility, sorry. But what I like about him is he's a bit of a chameleon of an author in that every book he writes like the sort of classic in the genre. So Rules of Civility is A Great Gatsby, and he writes like Scott Fitzgerald. A Gentleman in Moscow is a Russian epic novel, and he writes like Tolstoy. And The Lincoln Highway is a great American road book, and it's written in sort of the style of Steinbeck and all those people. But he's good enough to pull it off, so it doesn't just feel like a bad tribute. They're actually really good books in their own right. So I'm looking forward to that, but I'll also add to that the Parasolverse.
Fantastic. I've wound up just sort of building on some of my confessions over the course of the podcast with 3 half-started Len Deighton novels. So I'm going to need to take a sort of stiff drink to get past the sexism and occasional racism and just get those finished. But also I realized at the end of last episode, every spec fic I really like, or sci-fi for wankers, as Tamsin put it, actually winds up being a film noir gumshoe novel just set in a science fiction universe. And I would have thought that was a very small genre, but it turns out it's not. And my new novel in that genre is Jeff Noon's A Man of Shadows, set in a city where it's always bright. The sky is literally just made of light bulbs and neon, and is sometimes as close as like, half a meter above your head. And because there's no day or night cycle, everyone lives on their own personal timeline, and wacky consequences ensue. But I also, from previous recommendations, actually really want to read Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl, which was recommended by Dina in a previous episode.
Yeah. So I'm going to be spending my summer in marking and asking students to please read the instructions on the unit site and the syllabus, because I've answered your question there already.
It's the new Read the UN Charter.
Oh, it's the teaching version of Read the UN Charter. I feel like linking that video of Snoop Dogg asking students to read the syllabus to my unit site and news announcement. But I know I can't. But also I have I'm on the cusp of qualifying for a number of very, very small field invitational only world ranking disabled golf events over summer that will be televised on KO and Fox Sports if I when they occur. So I'm hoping I manage to get across the qualification. I was the first reserve for the last one, and we'll see what happens with the next few.
Tamsin coming to the small screen in the world of golf if you're in Australia and subscribing to Australian sports channels.
Now, look, before we wrap up, I want to make sure that we don't end our last episode without asking what became a traditional question on the pod, which is, Douglas, what are you wearing?
Well, it's just barely at a temperature level where I can still wear a tie. So I'm wearing a blue shirt with dark blue braces, a paisley tie in teal and dark blue and gold, my favorite green linen trousers. And I've got to say, if you don't own linen trousers for the summer, you just need to go out and get some, or indeed get the local tailor at your local shopping centre to run you up some, as I'm doing. But also I've got a fabulous, very broad American check jacket that is just about light enough to wear in this weather and has kind of mid-century, vaguely Mad Men vibe that I'm leaning into. Well, look, it's been an amazing first season, wildly exceeding any expectations I might have had. And that's down to my marvelous co-hosts, Tamsin, Imogen, Juliette, and in her absence, Dina, and to you, the listeners. We will be back in late January or February 2025 with season 2. In the meantime, why not recommend us to a friend or put a few episodes on your reading lists? In any event, thanks for joining us, everyone, and you'll hear from us again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Hello.